The patient was dying. 6 alien surgeons surrounded the operating table, their gelatinous, bioluminescent skin shifting in pulses of blue and violet under the sterile surgical lights. Their elongated arms hovered over the instruments, hesitant, uncertain. The lead surgeon, Dranev, folded his secondary arms against his smooth, bluish torso, his 3 eye stalks locked on the fluctuating vitals displayed in the holographic interface. The readings were chaotic. Every second brought new alarms. The administrator's triple-lobed heart was failing. His oxygen saturation was dropping. His nervous system was sending erratic signals to his organs. "We have done all we can," Dranev declared, his deep, resonant voice firm but heavy. A wave of solemn agreement passed through the team. The patient, a senior administrator of the Planetary Council, lay motionless beneath the glowing, translucent layers of surgical containment. His species, the Villani, were physiologically complex. Redundant systems, multi-layered neural structures, adaptive metabolic responses, an evolutionary marvel, but also a medical nightmare when things went wrong. And things had gone very wrong. "We replaced the failing cardiac tissue ogre," the cardiac specialist reported, his voice tight with frustration. "The grafts began integrating, but the immune response became catastrophic. His body is rejecting the synthetic replacements faster than we can compensate." Dranev's eye stalks twisted toward the immune suppression display. The rejection markers were off the charts. Even the most advanced suppression protocols weren't slowing the response. "The synthetic vascular stabilizers have collapsed," Solmar added, his elongated fingers gliding across the control panel. "Neural synchronization is failing. The autonomic system is in free fall." "This is a cascade failure," Dranev muttered. "Every attempt to stabilize one system has destabilized another. Even if we restore heart function, his nervous system is no longer regulating properly." The team fell silent. Solmar hesitated. "Perhaps we should. Notify the council. Begin drafting the death report." Dranev exhaled through his vent slits. He hated admitting failure. The administrator was not just a political figure, he was the linchpin of the current negotiations between the Villani and the United Systems Coalition. If he died, it wouldn't just be a tragedy. It would be an interstellar incident. But none of that mattered if the body on the table shut down. Then, from the doorway, came an unfamiliar voice. "Are you seriously giving up already?" All 6 surgeons turned in unison, their eye stalks swiveling. A human stood there, arms crossed, eyes sharp with something between irritation and amusement. Dr. Wesley Carter. His surgical scrubs were still speckled from the procedure he had just finished in the adjacent ward. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and there was an unmistakable impatience in the way he scanned the room. "You've done everything you know how to do," Wesley said, stepping inside, "but that doesn't mean everything's been done." Dranev straightened, his tendrils stiffening. "Human, this is a classified surgical suite. Your presence is unauthorized." Yeah, Wesley said, waving a hand. "Look, are you going to let him die because of bureaucracy, or are you going to let me try something?" Ogre sputtered. "You cannot simply." "Let him speak," Dranev cut in, though his voice was clipped. He turned his full attention to Wesley, skeptical but listening. "This is a complex failure. The patient's body is rejecting all interventions. His cardiac function is failing, his nervous system is destabilizing, and his immune response is escalating out of control. What could you possibly offer that we have not already attempted?" Wesley stepped closer to the holographic interface, his sharp blue eyes scanning the administrator's deteriorating vitals. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the readouts, piecing together the situation. Alien anatomy was always a challenge, but Wesley had learned one thing in his years of interstellar medicine: every species thinks they're unique, but biology always plays by the same rules. "You're thinking like engineers," he said finally. "You see the body as a machine. When one part breaks, you replace it. But bodies don't work like that, not human ones, not his." Dranev's eye stalks twitched. "Explain." "His body isn't rejecting your interventions because they're faulty," Wesley said, pointing at the hologram. "It's rejecting them because you're fighting against his biology instead of working with it. You're introducing foreign elements when you should be reinforcing what's already there." Ogre frowned, reinforcing. How? Wesley turned to face them. If his immune system hates synthetic grafts, we don't use synthetic. We grow what he needs organically, from his own tissue. A ripple of disbelief passed through the team. You are suggesting regenerative techniques at this stage, Dranev asked. That could take weeks, and he has minutes. Not if we accelerate the process, Wesley countered. Localized cellular stimulation, direct vascular integration, and targeted hormone regulation. His body can grow the replacement tissue fast enough if we trick it into thinking it's an emergency response. Salmar's eye stalks twisted in alarm. That is reckless. If we lose control of the process, it could trigger uncontrolled cellular hyperplasia. Only if you do it wrong, Wesley said. Lucky for him, I don't do things wrong. Dranev hesitated. The human was brash, reckless. But there was something else, a certainty in his voice. A confidence that wasn't arrogance, but experience. And they had already exhausted every other option. Prepare the regeneration unit, Dranev said at last, his voice heavy with reluctant approval. We will assist you, but understand this, if your attempt fails, the responsibility is yours. Fair enough, Wesley said with a shrug. Let's get to work. The room exploded into motion. Salmar adjusted the containment field, while Ogre prepared the cellular matrix. Wesley recalibrated the regeneration unit, adapting it from its standard synthetic grafting function to full in vivo tissue engineering. He worked fast, isolating a sample of viable cardiac tissue from the administrator's failing heart and transferring it into the culture medium. We'll use his own cells as the base, Wesley explained, his hands moving rapidly over the controls. Accelerate mitosis using bioelectric stimulation. Guide the new tissue onto the damaged areas using direct vascular integration. If we keep immune suppression localized instead of systemic, we can prevent rejection. Dranev watched skeptically as Wesley introduced a controlled cocktail of growth factors, stem cell enhancers, and immunomodulators into the administrator's bloodstream. The alien team murmured among themselves, clearly skeptical but following his lead. Now, Wesley said, positioning the regeneration unit over the patient's chest, we scaffold the new tissue directly onto the existing structures. He activated the field. The administrator's body twitched. The monitors flickered. The alien surgeons tensed. But the new tissue held. His cardiac output is stabilizing, Ogre reported, voice tinged with disbelief. Immune markers decreasing, Salmar added. Rejection response is neutralizing. Dranev stared at the monitors. This is unprecedented. Wesley exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Yeah, well, get used to it. The administrator's vitals were holding. The cardiac tissue was integrating, but Wesley knew this was just the beginning. Because the heart wasn't the only thing failing. And the hardest part was still ahead. The administrator's heart was beating again. That was the good news. The bad news was that his nervous system was still failing. Cardiac function is stabilizing, Salmar reported, his eye stalks twisting toward the vitals display. But his secondary neural pathways are still desynchronized. His body isn't registering the new heart as its own. Dranev's tendrils tightened. If the nervous system does not reintegrate, autonomic regulation will continue to degrade. The patient will suffer systemic collapse, heart failure, respiratory failure, then full neural shut. Yeah, we get it, Wesley interrupted, already moving. He's not out of the woods yet. Wesley had expected this. The administrator species, the Villani, had a dual-layered nervous system, one responsible for conscious thought and voluntary movement, and another that handled autonomic function, similar to the human autonomic nervous system but far more complex. The problem was disconnect. His brain still thought the heart was failing. The new tissue had integrated, but his body's autonomic programming hadn't updated. Right now it was like a computer running two conflicting operating systems, one trying to shut the body down, the other trying to keep it alive. And Wesley needed to force a reboot. All right, Wesley muttered, adjusting the neural interface. If his system won't recognize the fix, we make it recognize it. Dranev frowned. How do you propose we do that? We retrain his nervous system, Wesley said, tapping a control panel. We make it learn how to communicate with the new heart, like physical therapy for an organ. Ogre hesitated. We attempted neural stabilization earlier. It failed. Because you were trying to override the signals, Wesley said. You can't force the body to accept something new. You have to make it think it's always been there. Drainev's tendrils twitched in frustration. You are proposing neural reconditioning. Exactly, Wesley said. But we need to be careful. If we do this wrong, his brain might think his heart is still failing and shut it down for good. A tense silence settled over the surgical bay. Then, reluctantly, Dranev gave a slow nod. Proceed. The team moved into action. Wesley positioned the neural interface over the administrator's brainstem, aligning it with the secondary nervous clusters responsible for autonomic integration. If he was right, the key wasn't brute forcing synchronization, it was guiding it. Adjusting stimulation parameters, Wesley murmured. We'll start with low-frequency bioelectric pulses, then increase gradually to match his natural rhythm. Solmar monitored the administrator's metabolic levels. If his body perceives this as stress, it may trigger an emergency cascade. That's why we go slow, Wesley said. We don't force a response. We coax one. He activated the interface. A controlled pulse of electrical stimulation coursed through the administrator's secondary nervous system, mimicking the natural signals that should have been synchronizing with his heart. The monitors spiked erratically. The alien surgeons tensed. Hold, Wesley said, adjusting the output. We're almost there. The administrator's body twitched involuntarily. Neural activity increasing, Ogre reported. But it is still unstable. Come on, Wesley muttered, fine-tuning the frequency. He shifted the pulse pattern, adjusting it microscopically to better match the administrator's native neural rhythm. If he forced a sync too quickly, the nervous system would reject it. But if he matched it precisely, the vitals evened out. Autonomic signals. Stabilizing, Solmar said, disbelief creeping into his voice. Ogre's eye stalks widened. His body is accepting the new heart. Dranev leaned forward. Impossible. Wesley grinned. Not impossible. Just human medicine. But he wasn't done yet. The administrator's body had accepted the change. Now he needed to make sure his mind did too. Because if the patient didn't wake up soon, none of this would matter. The hardest part was still ahead. The administrator's heart was beating. His nervous system was stabilizing. But he was still unconscious. And if Wesley didn't wake him up soon, the alien's body might decide that staying comatose was the safest option. His autonomic functions are self-sustaining, Ogre reported, double-checking the vitals, but his higher cognitive activity remains suppressed. Dranev studied the brainwave readings with narrowed eye stalks. His conscious neural pathways are inactive. If we do not restore function soon, his brain may assume a permanent low-energy state. Meaning, Wesley asked? Meaning, Ogre said, his body might decide that waking up is unnecessary. Wesley exhaled. That wasn't as ridiculous as it sounded. The Villani had highly adaptive physiology. If the body experienced enough trauma, it could enter a metabolic state where it prioritized survival above all else, including consciousness. It was an evolutionary failsafe, meant to protect the brain during catastrophic injuries. Unfortunately, that meant Wesley wasn't just fighting a medical condition anymore. He was fighting biology itself. All right, Wesley muttered, rubbing his forehead. We need to wake him up before his brain locks him in. Dranev frowned. Forcing premature consciousness could destabilize his recovery. I'm not forcing anything, Wesley said. I'm giving his brain a reason to wake up. Solmar tilted his head. And how do you intend to do that? By engaging his cognitive functions, Wesley said, already adjusting the neural stimulator. Right now, his brain doesn't think it needs to be awake. We need to trigger a response, something instinctive, something that forces his higher functions to kick in. Dranev folded his arms. A biological demand for wakefulness. Exactly, Wesley said. We need to snap him out of it. Ogre's eye stalks twitched. What do you propose? A pain stimulus. Too risky, Wesley said immediately. Pain could shock his system and push him further into unconsciousness. We need something that demands attention but feels natural. Draneev's tendrils curled in thought. His species is highly hierarchical. He is accustomed to making high-level decisions. Wesley snapped his fingers. That's it. Ogre blinked. What is? His job, Wesley said, already reprogramming the neural stimulator. We wake him up by forcing him to make a decision. Solmar made a skeptical clicking sound. You wish to wake him by making him think he is working. Wesley grinned. Exactly. The alien doctors stared at him. Draneev sighed. You humans are truly absurd. Yeah, Wesley muttered, fine-tuning the neural stimulation pattern. You got a better idea. Draneev said nothing. Didn't think so, Wesley muttered. All right, let's bring him back. He activated the stimulator. A gentle pulse flowed into the administrator's brainstem, targeting the regions responsible for problem-solving and decision-making. Instead of trying to wake him by forcing consciousness, Wesley was recreating the conditions under which he normally woke up engaged, thinking, working. At first, nothing happened. The alien surgeons watched, silent and tense. The monitors continued their slow, rhythmic beeping. Then, the administrator's fingers twitched. Motor response detected, Solmar reported. The alien's breathing deepened. His eyelids fluttered. Wesley leaned in. Come on, big guy. Time to get back to work. A heartbeat passed. Then another. The administrator's eyes snapped open. His translucent pupils contracted sharply, adjusting to the light. His gaze flickered between the unfamiliar faces surrounding him, disoriented but focused. Draneev stepped forward. Administrator. But before he could finish, the alien's voice cut through the silence, hoarse but firm. Status report, he demanded. The room froze. Draneev hesitated. Administrator, you have just undergone. Status, the administrator repeated, sharper this time. His gaze locked onto Draneev. Why am I in a surgical ward? Why are you here? What has happened? Ogre made a noise somewhere between a groan and a laugh. By the stars, he thinks he's in a briefing. Wesley grinned. Told you it would work. The administrator finally turned to him, studying him carefully. Who are you? Wesley smirked. I'm the guy who didn't let you die. The alien took this in, then exhaled slowly. He turned back to Draneev. I require a full summary, and contact the council. I will need to be briefed immediately. Draneev looked like his brain had exploded. Administrator, you must rest. There is no time for rest, the alien interrupted. Schedule the meeting. Ogre shook his head in disbelief. He wakes up from near death, and the first thing he wants to do is get back to work. Wesley stretched, rolling his shoulders. Some things are universal. Draneev turned to him, his expression unreadable. Your methods are reckless, irrational, completely unorthodox. Wesley shrugged. Yeah, but they work. Ogre sighed. I do not know whether to be horrified or impressed. Wesley grinned. Why not both? The administrator was alive, awake and recovering. And for Wesley, that was all that mattered. The administrator was awake. That was the victory. But Wesley knew better than to celebrate just yet. The real challenge wasn't bringing him back, it was keeping him alive long enough for his body to accept that survival was permanent. Ogre was already scanning the administrator's vitals, his eye stalks twisting in disbelief. Neural activity is stable. Cardiac function holding. Oxygen saturation returning to normal levels. Draneev studied the readings. He should not be this functional so soon. His body has just undergone an extreme physiological event. Wesley wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. Yeah, well, turns out the best way to keep someone alive is to give them a reason to stay that way. The administrator's gaze sharpened, still adjusting to his surroundings. I assume, he said, voice rasping, that I was in critical condition. Draneev exhaled. You were beyond critical. You were dead. The administrator blinked, considering this. Then he turned back to Wesley. And you are the one responsible for reversing that condition. Wesley smirked. That's the polite way of putting it. The administrator exhaled slowly, his translucent skin shifting to a darker hue, probably the Villani equivalent of reluctant approval. Your methods. Unorthodox. Dangerous. Reckless Drainov answered before Wesley could. Ineffective, Wesley added, crossing his arms. The administrator was silent for a moment. Then he turned to Drainov. Have they briefed the council? Drainov stiffened. You must rest. Your system is still recovering. The administrator waved a hand dismissively. My system will recover. My work cannot wait. Ogre muttered something under his breath. You nearly die, and your first instinct is to get back to work. Unbelievable. Wesley laughed. Ogre, my friend, you don't get it. This right here? This is how you know he's going to be fine. The administrator's gaze flicked back to Wesley, studying him carefully. You are not Villani. You are human. Last I checked, Wesley said. You do not think like a physician. Also, last I checked. The administrator exhaled again, slower this time. His vitals remained steady. Then, to Wesley's surprise, the alien inclined his head slightly in unmistakable gesture of respect. Then I am fortunate, the administrator said, that my physicians knew when to step aside. Drainov's tendrils stiffened, but he did not argue. The administrator turned back to the alien surgeons. If the council has not yet been informed of my condition, send the report immediately. Schedule the briefing in 3 hours, and prepare a full transcript of the medical interventions used in my treatment. I would like to review them. Drainov hesitated. You wish to review your own procedure? If a technique exists that can circumvent biological rejection, I will ensure it is known, the administrator said. He glanced at Wesley. Assuming your kind is willing to share your methods. Wesley raised an eyebrow. That depends. You planning on crediting me? Or am I about to be classified as unknown variable in procedure report? The administrator's lips twitched slightly, a barely there smirk. I will ensure you receive the recognition you deserve. Drainov looked utterly bewildered. You would trust human medicine. The administrator's gaze was steady. It is difficult to argue with results. Ogre made an exasperated sound. Unbelievable. They refused to follow protocol, break every medical convention, and now they're getting praised for it. Wesley grinned. Now you're catching on. The administrator exhaled, stretching his arms slightly. Dr. Carter. Wesley raised an eyebrow. Yeah, you have my gratitude. For once, Wesley didn't have a sarcastic response. He just nodded. Glad I could help. The administrator turned back to Drainov. Prepare the briefing, and someone bring me food. If my body is expected to remain alive, I will require sustenance. Wesley chuckled. Now he really sounds like a recovering patient. Drainov sighed, rubbing his temples. I have changed my mind. Human medicine is not absurd. Ogre glanced at him. It's not. Drainov exhaled, exhausted. It is infuriating. Wesley stretched his arms over his head. You'll learn to love it. The administrator was alive, awake, recovering. And for Wesley, that was all that mattered.